Welcome to Capitalism That Works, a series co-produced by GlobalTreehouse and Jesper Koll. Today is session 2, and I want to talk about Japan's elite and how Japan's elite actually leads by example. And when I talk about elite, I mean predominantly the technocracy, the Japanese bureaucracy, as well as actually the Japanese politicians. So in other words, it is the administrative state that is the elite of Japan, and in my opinion, it actually works extremely well to ensure that it's not vested interests, that it's not populist instincts, but that it is actually the good of the people that gets served. So let me start with some specific examples. And when you talk about Japan, sooner or later, everything starts and ends with the bubble economy. And I want to make you aware that the starting point of the Japanese bubble economy was not something in Japan, but something outside of Japan. It was the Plaza Accord, when in 1985, the United States of America forced a massive devaluation of the dollar onto the world and specifically on Japan. And that massive appreciation of the yen, which went from 260 against the dollar to 160 against the dollar within a couple of months, it's threatened to really squeeze to death the Japanese economy. And so the Japanese elite was struggling to come up with a solution that could counter the deflationary impact of dollar depreciation of Japan. And what they came up with is deregulation of financial markets, deregulation of the real estate market in order to create, and this was official policy, an asset doubling plan. It's very important. You remember in the 1960s, then Prime Minister Ikeda launched the income doubling plan, which got Japan onto the world stage. In counter policy to the Plaza Accord, it was the ruling elite's asset doubling plan that actually got things going, created a massive boom in not just asset prices, but also domestic demand, which saved the Japanese economy from the deflation that could have come from the Plaza Accord. Now, we got this bubble. Real estate prices surged, the stock market surged, and by about 1988, the Japanese elite began to think, oh my God, there are big negative effects from the bubble economy. And as a result of that, the Japanese elite, the Ministry of Finance, the Bank of Japan, and the other elite bureaucrats started to think about how to step on the brake. And the biggest break actually came from the Bank of Japan. And it is very, very important to note that the Bank of Japan is the only central bank that actually burst a bubble. Never in economic history have we seen the ruling elite consciously wanting to break a bubble. And it was Bank of Japan Governor Mieno. He became the governor in December 1989, and in his first speech, it was fantastic. In his first speech, he goes something like, "Thank you for appointing me to this position." And the second sentence was, "Bad things are happening in my country. A graduate from the best university entering to work for the best company in Japan can no longer dream of ever being able to afford living in an apartment within a 2-hour commute. This is a bubble, this is bad, and I will burst it." And they did. They hiked interest rates from 3% to 8% within literally just half a year, and the bubble collapsed. Now, of course, there was an enormous amount of hardship that came from the deleveraging, that came from the negative wealth effects, that came from, yes, the collapse of real estate prices and the collapse of the bubble economy. But what's very interesting is that the Japanese people, homeowners, never got thrown out of their home. They had to pay down their mortgage into negative equity, which did not feel very good, but the overarching effect is that basically by the early millennium, Japan became cheap, Japan became affordable for the next generation. And it's interesting, today in 2021, Tokyo is the only major city on earth where if you work at a Starbucks with the average salary, you can actually afford to buy the average apartment within a 1-hour commute. That's impossible in London, in Shanghai, in Los Angeles, or in Berlin. So it's very interesting that there was a reset that occurred consciously, inducing the bursting of the bubble economy for the bad effects that it had on society. Yes, the elite in Japan, the technocrats in Japan, the politicians in Japan are not afraid to go against the big vested interests, are not afraid to actually do something that is not popular, but that in the long run is actually going to be right for the country. And let me give you a couple of other examples. Good inflation. I mean, is inflation really a good thing? When you look, for example, at the price of medical services in the United States, the price for medical services for consumers doubles every 7 or 8 years. Do wages double every 7 or 8 years? Absolutely not. Here in Japan, medical services are considered a public good, something that society owes to its people. And what you do see is a steadfast control on the level of inflation. The government regulates the prices, so makes sure that the profits of the pharmaceutical companies, of the medical service providers, do get redistributed into the purchasing power of the Japanese people. And this is not socialism. This is not hiking corporate taxes on everybody, but it is pinpoint precision management for the good of the Japanese people. And that's something where the Japanese elite excels. We had another example of going against vested interests recently with telecommunications charges. It was a couple of years ago that the Japanese Prime Minister invited into his office the CEOs of Japan's leading telecommunication companies. And he had one chart that showed the price of a mobile phone contract. Like for like, it showed that the cost of a mobile phone contract in Tokyo was about 40% higher than it is in London, in New York, in Taipei, etc. And the Prime Minister looked the CEOs in the eyes, pointed at the chart, and said, "This is a national embarrassment. Fix it." And it's very interesting. There was no law that was passed. There was no rule that was being imposed, but the ruling elite in Japan is not afraid to shame big business into doing something for the good of all the people. And that's what makes, in my opinion, Japan a form of capitalism that works. It is important to have a free market system, to have the creativity, the innovation, the price-finding mechanisms, etc. But it's also important to have a ruling elite that actually does the right thing to serve the purchasing power of the people, and that's what here in Japan is happening very well. Another example is, of course, the fact that Japan's elite does lead by example in terms of reforming itself. Yes, everywhere around the world, particularly in America and Europe, governments have become bloated. There's too much institutional work, too much red tape. The technological changes that have occurred allow for much easier and faster processes to come through. It's not a question of whether government is big or whether government is small. It's a question of having good government, of having efficient government, of having government that actually serves its people in an effective way. And Japan, in my reckoning, is the only major national economy where the number of bureaucracies has actually been shrunk. In 1995, 1996, then Prime Minister Hashimoto introduced administrative reform which shrank the number of major bureaucracies from 22 to 13. This makes the government more efficient, more effective, and quite frankly, it is something that anybody working in the private sector has to do all the time, because we always have to innovate our own internal processes if we want to serve our customers, in the best way. And Japan's government elite is actually capable of doing that. And that's a sharp contrast to this draining of the swamp that some Americans advocate, which quite frankly is not constructive, but it's destructive. Or it stands also in sharp contrast to what we get in Europe, where year after year, more layers of bureaucracy are being built on top. So Japan, the ruling elite, the administrative state, perfectly capable of reforming itself. And it's noteworthy that Japan always has a cabinet minister in charge of administrative reform. And recently, Prime Minister Suga, by introducing a digital agency, trying to speed up the digitalization, trying to speed up the reform of outdated processes, is actually happening here in Japan. And I beg you, find me examples of where that is happening in the United States or in Europe, and you're unfortunately hard-pressed to find that. So the ruling elite in Japan works for the people. The ruling elite is not afraid to take on political interests, to take on big business interests in order to actually manage for a better outcome. And this is not socialism. This is good government, because government is supposed to work for the people, is supposed to redistribute some of the excesses that free market capitalism inevitably generates. Bursting a bubble before the bubble breaks by itself, yes, that is the role of the elite, because the dreams of the young generation actually depend on this. Making sure that medical costs and medical services are available to everybody in Japan at an affordable rate, that is something that the elite must do, and here in Japan it does actually very well. Now, of course, it's not just the elite. Japan also has a very strong civil society. And when you actually do the numbers, you find that the impact that non-profit institutions have on the Japanese economy is now slightly higher than 5% of GDP. What is interesting? Before the Fukushima disaster and tsunami, it was less than 3% that civil society contributed to overall GDP. But since the Fukushima disaster, volunteerism, non-profit institutions have greatly began to impact the Japanese economy in a very positive way. So we've got a ruling elite, we've got a civil state here, an administrative state in Japan that is constantly looking to reform itself, constantly looking to better itself, and not afraid to take on the big vested interests. That, in my opinion, is exactly why Japan is a form of capitalism that works. Thank you very much for having joined us on this session of the series produced by GlobalTreehouse and myself, Jesper Koll. I look forward to welcoming you to some of the other sessions in the future. Thank you very much.